Welcome to you both to GBNews. Alan, let me start with you. There's a big battle going on, it seems to me, at the moment between civil servants and ministers, and I'm very sorry about it, and I'm sure you, as a former civil servant, are very sorry about it. But I wonder if part of it is that ministers think that if anything goes wrong, ministers take the blame, but if anything goes wrong, civil servants never carry the can. Civil servants are not accountable. Do you think that is part of what is going on? And what do you say about the accountability of civil servants?
I think civil servants obviously have accountability, but the key accountability is with ministers. And the issue seems to be, I think, that in a crisis, particularly a short-term hot crisis, and they sort it out, ministers are very happy to say, I took the responsibility and it worked. It's when crises go on for longer, like, say, the Iraq War, like Grenfell, like COVID, that ministers are less willing to say that they take full responsibility. And they tend to look around for who's to blame. And that might be easy things like the weather or the EU or the Chinese or sometimes even officials. But it's very rarely that they'll put their hands up and say, I was to blame for this long-term crisis and I take responsibility for it.
OK, Alan, but on the other hand, can you think of any instance, really, where a civil servant, however poorly he or she might have done the job, has actually had to walk rather than being simply redeployed to another department? Are there any instances of civil servants actually carrying accountability?
Well, the constitutional position, as you know, Michael, is that ministers take responsibility, and when civil servants are involved, they will often say, I was doing it because my minister told me to. Now, do you say, should civil servants take more responsibility? Well, perhaps they should. But, the constitutional position is that ministers are always in charge, and ministers are fronting up any crisis.
Andy Hughes, what's your reaction to the news of Theresa May's book? What do you think it might tell us? Why is she going for things like Hillsborough and Grenfell Tower?
Well, I think it's very important that we look at all sorts of different scandals. I've written about some very silly things, some very funny things, but on the other hand, some very serious things as well. And I think it's really important that we look at both sides of the spectrum here, from the funny and the silly, all the way through to the very sad and the very serious. And I'm sure Theresa May, with her former position, will have a lot of inside information that she can put into a book and perhaps address new things, new angles, new perspectives. And I think it's very important, especially that we look again at some of these really, really awful scandals and difficult things that have happened politically over the years. It's all very well if you read my book and I touch on some of the serious things, but I focus more on some of the silly things. So it's really important that we have that balance between all the different writers, all the different scandals throughout the years.
I'm not so surprised to hear that Theresa May is going to talk about Grenfell Tower, because a few days after it happened, it was a few days after the general election of 2017, she went to the scene and it was not a success. People didn't think that she showed enough connection with the victims and obviously the families of the victims. But Hillsborough, Andy, is a bit more of a surprise, isn't it? I mean, Hillsborough is more than 30 years ago, I think.
It is, but still very, very important to many people. I mean, I was born in Liverpool, and I have many Liverpudlian friends, and it's still right at the heart of people who live there. Extremely important that it's still kept in the news and in literature, and it's discussed more, and people talk about it much, much more because how it was handled was a scandal. What happened at the time was a scandal. And for people who have been right at the very top, like Theresa May, it's fantastic that she's still bringing this to the front so people can read about it and learn more. Now, you say it's 30 years ago, but there's a whole new generation, not just of Liverpudlians, but a whole new generation of people from all over the world that need to read about what happened and what went wrong and how it was handled afterwards as well.
Alan Evans, we always say after any of these terrible tragedies that lessons have been learned and never again and so on. But tell me, are civil servants actually educated in things that have gone horribly wrong in the past in order to learn lessons?
I don't think they are educated well enough. Let me give you a good example, though, which was actually last weekend. I think, and I'm not an expert on banking, that the way in which the Chancellor and his officials at Treasury handled the Silicon Valley Bank crisis and managed to ensure that it didn't become a great banking crisis like Lehman's or the crisis of 2008 was very impressive. And I think the Treasury does try and learn lessons. But there is a big problem in British politics that, as you know, Michael, ministers turn over a lot, and so do the turnover of civil servants. Means that often there isn't this corporate knowledge and corporate history. And there's a brilliant book written by the late Professor Anthony King and Ivor Crewe called The Blunders of Our Government. And if I were the Cabinet Office and I wanted to spend money wisely, I would spend £1,000 every year and buy how many copies you can get, 50 copies of that, and say that every Cabinet Minister should read this and learn it. And if I was Keir Starmer, I'd say his shadow cabinet should take it on holiday in the summer and read it, and they can't come back until they've read it, because it shows, to pick up your point and what you said earlier, that, you know, too often crises happen and history is, if not repeating itself, it's making another attempt to come the same way.
That is a very good recommendation. I'm sure the book by Andy Hughes would also be a very good recommendation. Thanks to him, and thanks to Alan Evans.